Hey guys, welcome to a new movie review. Today I'm going to be talking about the latest X-Men film, X-Men Dark Phoenix. This film is directed by Simon Kinberg, who's wrote and produced a lot of X-Men films in the past. Bryan Singer and Matthew Vaughn are probably the two most notable directors to work on X-Men films, and James Mangold for the Wolverine films as well. But this is Simon Kinberg's first film ever. He hasn't directed a film before this, and it's obviously his first X-Men film on top of that too. He's produced films and wrote films before, specifically X-Men films, but he's never really directed a film before. So I was kind of interested to see someone who wasn't Bryan Singer or a Matthew Vaughn or James Mangold kind of step in to direct another installment of X-Men. And now that Disney bought 20th Century Fox, I don't really know how much of the 20th Century Fox material they're going to use for X-Men films here on out. It might just be completely different, or it might just be all MCU related items or MCU related X-Men, depending on how they choose to pursue that. But anyway, back to this film, Dark Phoenix. In this installment of the X-Men franchise, we're into the 1990s now. I think this film is actually almost 7 years before the very first X-Men film, as far as what I can tell. And as far as what Days of Future Past is letting us kind of know what this new timeline is for X-Men, since Days of Future Past kind of set us on a new timeline for the X-Men franchise and stuff like that. But in this film, you guys, it's about the X-Men helping out NASA right away in the movie. This space mission goes wrong. There's this dark matter out in space. It's kind of ruining this space mission that NASA's going on. And the X-Men are able to help out. But as a result, Jean Grey is exposed to that dark matter that kind of caused the problem to begin with. And so when they get back to Earth, Jean Grey is acting kind of strange. She wants to go to a house where that person is believed to be long dead, and she has power, and she feels good with this power, and she's kind of unleashing her anger and rage at random times, and it's really hurting people. And she seems much more powerful than any other mutant that's at the X-Men Academy and things like that. So basically, her powers get out of hand after a while, and she has all these anger and rage issues. And there's a character played by Jessica Chastain that kind of comes into play, and she seems to want to push Jean Grey to use this darker ability, more powerful ability to Jean Grey's advantage, and to kind of make sure that the other X Men are kind of bowing down to her, and she's getting her way and satisfying herself and things like that. There's all this unhealthy things that she's doing with these powers that really are not good for her to begin with. And obviously, she got these powers through this strange event that happened in space right away at the beginning of the movie. So throughout the course of the film, the X Men had to have to question, is sacrificing the whole team worth it to get Jean Grey back to the way she was? Or do they have to kill Jean Grey in order for the X Men to survive? What exactly do they have to do? Do they have to make that tough choice of killing off this beloved X Men character that they all love and have feelings for, but do they have to sacrifice other team members and even other characters that they might even love even more just to get Jean Grey back to the way she was? So there's all these morals, all these questions, and all these scenarios that the X-Men have to figure out over the course of X-Men Dark Phoenix. So overall, guys, I liked this film. I know this film had a lot of behind-the-scenes drama back when it was made. Obviously, with Simon Kinberg directing his first film ever. I don't even think he's directed a short film or anything before this. Obviously, he had a lot to take on. There was a lot for him to live up to, with Bryan Singer and Matthew Vaughn and James Mangold all directing X-Men films, and obviously they're very talented people. So he had a lot to live up to when he was directing this movie. I really liked it. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I think there's much better X-Men films out there. I think Days of Future Past, First Class, and Logan are immediately titles that come to mind for me that are just miles and miles better than this movie. But that doesn't mean that Dark Phoenix is necessarily a bad movie. I think the big problem with this movie for me, and obviously I'm going to go over all my positives and negatives in just a moment, but right off the bat, I think the biggest negative for me with this movie was it really is not very original, because the Dark Phoenix storyline, it was kind of taken on in X-Men 3 The Last Stand. We're going back to a storyline that we've already seen before in X-Men movies, so really the only options are You have to make it better than the last time you saw the Dark Phoenix storyline. You have to add something interesting to the story, and you have to bring something new and something new to the X-Men franchise all together into one film to make it work and to kind of satisfy everybody who's going to go see this movie, whether they're X-Men fans or just casual moviegoers and so forth like that. So I think Dark Phoenix succeeds on some of those things, but not necessarily on some of those other things that I just mentioned. So let's go over some positives and negatives of what I think work and what doesn't work about Dark Phoenix. So for my positives of this movie, I'll just say it right off the bat. I think Simon Kinberg did a pretty good job for a first-time director. There's just a lot of things you have to take on when you take on a big budget project like this. You have to satisfy the X-Men fans, the casual moviegoers, respect the timeline, respect the films that came before your film, respect the films that take place after your film takes place, because this film takes place in the 1990s, and obviously there's X-Men films like Days of Future Past and stuff like that that happened way later in the timeline for the X-Men franchise. So there's all these things you have to consider when you're directing a film for the X-Men franchise these days in 2019. And for a first-time director, I think Simon Kinberg, if I can pronounce his name correctly, did a very good job for his first time directing a feature film. I also thought Professor Xavier and Magneto had interesting, conflicting beliefs in this movie. Obviously, that's been going on since X-Men First Class, and obviously earlier X-Men films back when Bryan Singer and Brett Ratner and all of them directed X-Men films. That goes all the way back to those films too. But specifically when James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender play these characters, they've always had conflicting beliefs. And I think Xavier and Magneto had really interesting conflicting beliefs, and some of those beliefs came true in this movie now that they're so far into the franchise. So I thought their conflicting beliefs was an interesting aspect of this movie. I also liked that we had a very broken Jean Grey in this movie. You can really tell she was very conflicted as to how to handle this power that she obtains and what exactly to do with it, how to handle her anger, how to handle this mysterious woman that Jessica Chastain portrays, and how she's trying to persuade her to do these really horrible things and stuff like that. So it's a very broken Jean Grey, but I think it makes for a more interesting Jean Grey in this movie. I also like how the film plays around with the public eye's view on the X-Men, whether they view them as heroes, whether they view them as mutants, whether they view them as a public enemy or a public disturbance or public criminals. I really like how this film kind of betrays this idea, has an interesting viewpoint on it, and just kind of makes the X-Men more interesting as a result. I also like how the film has the message of using our gifts for the good of mankind. Obviously, a lot of superhero films use this message a lot, but I think it's really brought home here, especially when Xavier and Jean Grey kind of have their moments together in this movie. Whether it goes all the way back to her childhood or the two of them together when Jean Grey is going through all this trouble as she's known as the Dark Phoenix in this. I really think that message of using your gifts for the good and using your gifts for the good of mankind is a really powerful message, and I really think it was very handled well here in this movie too. Now for my negatives of Dark Phoenix. Like I said, my biggest problem with this movie, I think it's just not very original. Because the Dark Phoenix storyline was covered in X-Men: The Last Stand, and because there's just so many elements like the Xavier and Magneto conflicting beliefs and stuff like that, and just this X-Men doing superhero stuff, it's just not very original. There's just so many things in this film that other X-Men films have covered before and they've covered better. So that's probably my biggest complaint with this film. It's just not very original. They really could have came up with something more unique to tell the Dark Phoenix storyline, I thought. I also thought this film tried way too hard to be Bryan Singer and Matthew Vaughn. I really wish Simon Kinberg could have just been his own director for this, had his own vision. There's just so many moments in the film where I feel like he's trying to be Bryan Singer or trying to be Matthew Vaughn, that he didn't really make himself his own director in the process. I feel like he was just kind of copying the best of both worlds from those two directors to make an X-Men film rather than just making his own X-Men film to begin with. There's also some awkward first-time director conversation shots. There's one scene in particular where Michael Fassbender and this military man are having this really tense conversation. It literally goes from one shot of the military guy, then back to a shot of Michael Fassbender, back to a shot of the military guy, back to a shot of Michael Fassbender, back to the military guy, back to the Michael Fassbender. And I feel like Kinberg could have just found a more interesting way to shoot the scene because it just literally goes back and forth from shot to shot, and you can tell that they were just individually taken, and the camera slightly moved in between the two of them talking, and it just was just not a very interesting way to tell this scene in this movie. And there's obviously other examples of this, but that one in particular really took me off guard. So you could really tell in certain moments that that was Simon Kinberg's first time directing like a tense conversation in a movie. I also thought the alien villains that Jessica Chastain and her team of other villains play in this movie were really not super convincing. They really were just kind of your typical aliens trying to take over the world kind of thing, and I just really wasn't super convinced by it. And I do really feel that there are better X-Men films out there, whether it is covering the Dark Phoenix storyline, whether it is Xavier and Magneto having conflicting beliefs, or how Mystique plays a role in the X-Men, or how Jean Grey plays a role in the X-Men. I really feel like there's better examples of these mutants in earlier films that portray some of these ideas in this film better. So overall, I'm going to give X-Men Dark Phoenix, believe it or not, an 8.5 out of 10. I think the things that it does really well, it does very well. I thought it was a very enjoyable, entertaining film. There is a lot of problems with it. Obviously, it's not very original. I thought Simon Kinberg could have been his own director a little bit more rather than just copying Bryan Singer and Matthew Vaughn. Obviously, they could have handled with a better villain. Make the conversation shots a little more interesting than just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And obviously, there's better X-Men films out there, and a lot of the ideas that were portrayed in this film, I feel, have been portrayed better in earlier X-Men films. But I am going to give this film an 8.5 out of 10. I do recommend seeing it. It's not the best X-Men film. I think there's worse X-Men films out there. I would say this film, for me personally, I think I like this better than X-Men Apocalypse, and obviously a lot better than X-Men Origins Wolverine. It may be a little bit better than X-Men 3, but overall, almost all the other X-Men films you can imagine I thought were way better than this movie. Not to say that this film is bad, I just feel earlier X-Men films did a better job with certain ideas. But I do recommend this film, and if you like X-Men films, it's not a bad way to go. Make sure you see this movie.